All right. Well, welcome everybody to BotKeeper on the Edge. I am Gaynor Meilke from Charisma Inc., and we are a digital marketing and strategy agency that serves the accounting profession. And I am super excited today to have with me Luke Kiely from iComply. He's the CEO of iComply, which is a cybersecurity consulting firm. Did I put that in a nutshell correctly, Luke?
Yep, 100%. Yep. Consulting is probably the main service that we offer, in addition to virtual services like VCSO services, just to take the pressure off you having to do the information security management yourself.
Yeah, so today we are going to talk all about cybersecurity. And before people tune out because they've heard all there is to know about cybersecurity, I urge you to pay close attention to Luke. One of the reasons why we wanted to have him on the edge is because he really brings a different perspective to cybersecurity. And his mantra, which I love, is that security is something we do, not something we have. So if you've got a WISP program, the Written Information Security Plan, or you've got a third-party IT that's helping you with your firm, or you've drafted something yourself as to what your firm's security plan is. What Luke is going to talk about today is one, why perhaps that's not the first place to start, or if you've got that, what are you actually doing with that information that you've got in a document that you can implement in your firm. And he's also going to really bring a unique perspective from both a accounting tech side, and also he was in law enforcement fighting cybersecurity crimes. So without further ado, I'm going to ask you a few questions, Luke, and kind of get you to dive in. And I know that you and I have talked quite extensively about what are some of the myths that are kind of being circulated, urban myths in accounting on cybersecurity. What are your thoughts around those?
Look, to be fair, there's actually quite a few, and I think when we talk about myths, a lot of them tends to be not so much myths, but probably just some of the phrases and concepts and probably marketing spiel that tends to get pushed out there because they're very catchy and they tend to stick as well. I mean, you talk about one of them might be it's not a matter of if, but when you're going to be hacked. Now that may very well be the case, but it's largely an unhelpful statement. I think the more appropriately say if you're going to be attacked, how are you going to respond? What are you going to do? What course of action you're going to take? And I think rather than actually get sucked into the fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and the scaremongering side of things, is to really just to take a step back and look at it with a sensible head. Now, I'm going to take that one step further because I was talking to someone today about the phrase "think like a hacker." You need to think like a hacker to protect against a hacker. And if I'm being honest, I fundamentally disagree with that. Now, I've been in information security and cybersecurity for quite some time, and I can honestly say I've not had to think like a hacker to implement an information security program. And for the most part, most firms probably aren't equipped either with the knowledge, expertise, or even resource to think like that. So keep it simple. Ultimately, is just focus on what is in your sphere of control rather than actually trying to outsmart a cyber criminal.
Hmm. So that's interesting. What do you think's in the sphere of control for an average accounting firm? What are some of the
Honest,
things?
Honestly, a lot. I think a lot of firms overlook just how much control they've got. Now, if we're looking about, let's talk about the term financial institution, which invariably is going to cover probably most of the audience, whether you're an accounting firm, you're a tax firm, bookkeeper, you could actually be an insurance, you could actually be a university providing bursary services. You probably fall under the umbrella of being a financial institution, which imposes some legal requirements onto you, notably the FTC safeguards rule. And there's a lot of things you can do to actually meet the compliance, but not just meet it, exceed it. And there are probably two elements to how you actually tackle that. And that's whether you've born your company out of an on-premises network, or whether you've gone straight in and gone to the cloud-based networks. And there are different approaches depending on what kind of setup you've got. You could be hybrid. You know, the fact is, if you've got an on-premises infrastructure, then your approach is going to be very different, such as managing your assets differently, making sure that you've got the right kind of backups in place, having multi-factor authentication in place. And these are really, really standard run-of-the-mill kind of practices, but they're the kind of things that give you some level of assurance. Um, One thing when you talk about cybersecurity is people forget about business continuity, because fundamentally you've got to protect it against hackers, absolutely, but you've also got to provide availability. You've got to have the availability for your clients to be able to access their records, or you have to be able to access records on a regular basis. And if you lose that ability, then you are, in essence, triggering a security event. Um, Interesting or not interestingly, with the GDPR, if you actually lose availability of your client's data for even for a fraction of period of time, that actually loss of availability can trigger a security incident, which can be notifiable. So availability is actually quite an important aspect of what you do for your clients.
So just back up for a minute in case people don't know what the GDPR is. Can
So
you
the
explain?
general data protection regulation, which was born out of the EU, and since the UK have actually divorced the EU and gone through Brexit, the UK have now got their own version of this data protection legislation. We have got varying similarities of that across the US. So you've got the California Consumer Privacy Act, we have got Virginia, Ohio, Utah, Colorado, who are all implementing their own version of data protection legislation, but state by state, they're now implementing similar versions of data protection legislation. At the moment, there isn't a federal legislation that sits across it, but again,
Oh.
state by state is coming.
See, now that almost seems like I can't even believe that there's not a federal legislation and it's all being left at the state level. But what does that mean when I think about state level data protection? If you're got clients as an accounting firm, or you're a firm that does business either globally or nationally, then if you've got sales tax issues, you've got all of that data coming in. I wonder how many firms are even thinking about data protection on the state level. I know we think about it, from application level, but not necessarily from like the jurisdiction it's in.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Look, it's something you should definitely be thinking about. I mean, even from let's take GDPR for a second. If you've got a number of customers that are born in the EU and you're based in the US, the fact is you have to adhere to the EU legislation. You're legally bound by that to do it. Now, with the state legislation in the US, there are nuances, but for the most part, it becomes very samey in terms of what you actually need to do. But it's worth knowing what's actually happening in different spaces, because there are some nuances between the legislation. So again, the biggest question you have to ask yourselves, have you got any customers that are residing in different states that you may actually have to cater for? Having I operate with a legal register, and it's nothing more than an Excel spreadsheet that tells me all of the legislation I need to adhere to, whether it be cybersecurity, information security, data protection, employment law. Just having like a simple spreadsheet, knowing what is the legislation, what jurisdiction does it apply to, why it's actually relevant, and the last time you review it. Excel can be fantastic in that regard.
Well, I don't think there's too many accountants who would argue that Excel is a bad thing. But to that point, it seems almost, that's getting very granular. And then of course, not only do you have to maintain that, but you've got to train anybody who's working with you on, data handling, um, I guess methodologies and systems. So talk a little bit about that. We talked at the top of this chat about, you know, security is something that you do, not what you have. So you've got the spreadsheet where you're keeping track or tabs, no pun intended, on what you need to, take
Hmm.
like all of that, all of those legalities. Then what happens, once you've got that put together? What do you do?
Yeah, so when it comes to any firm, and again, if you fall under the umbrella of having to adhere to the FTC safeguards rule, you've got what's called a designated individual or a qualified individual that needs to run a security program. Now, what a security program means from one company or one firm to the next really will differ depending on whereabouts you're based in terms of the world, which state you're in, how many employees you've got, how many customers you've got, whether you've got on-prem infrastructure, whether you're cloud-based. It really does differ quite a lot. So you can use templates, absolutely, but it does have to be tailored towards your specific needs. Now, the qualified individual or whoever runs your information security program will probably be the one that has to drive this a lot of the time in terms of what does data handling and sensitivity need to look like. And you need to keep it very, very simple. Now, most information security policies can be done in probably a page or two. They don't need to be war and peace in terms of, you need to do, it's a document effectively outlining what is your approach for a specific thing, whether it's what's our approach towards password management, what's our approach towards backup management, what's our approach towards access controls. They have to be kept very simple. When it comes to data handling, you break it down into a number of things, and it could be, is that information public available, in which case there's no sensitivity whatsoever, anybody can have it and it doesn't cause you any harm. And that's when you start to go incrementally saying, well, we've next increment would be it's internal data, which means it's designed really for general sharing amongst the business, but ideally we don't want to get it outside of the business because it could cause us a little bit of disruption. And then you're going into the more sensitive data, which could be financial data, medical, healthcare, anything personally related, and that could be either confidential or restricted. You could use one or both, depending on how you want to scheme it. But the easy thing is just to break it down into 3 or 4 categories and what types of data fit within those categories, and be really clear. If it's marketing material that's already out there in the wide world, then it goes from potentially being confidential or restricted potentially to internal because it's now in the public domain. So its sensitivity's changed. If you've got an enormous marketing campaign set out for 2025, which you know that's going to be a market differentiator and is going to cause some differentiation between you and your competitors, you're not going to want that to get out. So you're going to want to keep that to being restricted or confidential. And then you might say, well, on that basis, only these people can access that information. They can only access it with their eyes and sight, or do we need to have access controls by storing it in a document management system such as SmartVault, or could be anything else? But really, you just need to think sensibly, saying, what's the data? How important is it to me? Do I want anybody else to see it?
Okay, so as far as tech, since you brought up document management, what should firms be looking at? I mean, now we've got an ecosystem, and most firms, either cloud-based or if they're still like with their own like on-premise servers that they're running like desktop programs or something like that, or there's a hybrid model. I mean, how do you wrap your like hands and your head around what needs to be done from, I think people tend to think the tech is going to take care of the security. And, we were talking with BotKeeper, before we went on, and obviously they have, safeguards in place with like SOC 1 and 2 and, all those things. So these individual solutions, they have their own security within them, but that doesn't absolve like the firm from kind of wrapping a layer of protection around that. And also then, as you brought up, access points. And it's not just, access points from people, it's access points of different devices. And, any touch point on that data has to be thought about and secured. So, is there a blanket statement that can like create a blanket of security?
No,
No.
there are so many layers and answers to that question because there are so many different perspectives. So let's talk about cloud-based solutions for a second. Now, naturally, when you migrate to the cloud, you do gain a lot of efficiency and you inherit a lot of really good security controls that invariably you can't do yourself with an on-premises solution. The thing with cloud solutions you have to recognize is that just by moving your data from an on-premises solution, whether it could be a server, your laptop, a hard drive, USB, it doesn't really matter, and you migrate that to the cloud, all you're doing is you're moving it from somebody else's server to somebody else's server. So let's use AWS as an example. You can move your data to AWS and it'll be very, very secure. The thing you've got is a principle or a model called the shared responsibility model. And what that says very clearly is that AWS is going to give you the infrastructure and the platform to store your data. What you put in there is 100% your responsibility. So you've got to determine what data is going to go into that, whether it be public, internal, confidential. Then who's going to have access to it. So you now actually have to put in some access controls in who am I going to share this document with or documents with? What kind of access can I have, whether it be read or write, or read, write, and share, download. You've also got the multi-factor authentication piece and saying, do you want people to have to go through numbers of layers to actually get to that document, such as having a secure link, whether it has to be multi-factor authentication to even get into that environment. Sorry, I actually just had a call. I don't know if that actually interrupted the flow there. So the shared responsibility model is you are responsible for the data, you are responsible for the access controls within that environment. The underlying infrastructure is AWS's responsibility at the end of the day. And what you tend to see a lot of the time is, you talk about SOC 2, for example. A lot of companies that don't have a SOC 2 type 1 or type 2 report, they tend to rely on AWS as an example, because they're saying, well, we're storing our data in a SOC 2 type 2 reported environment. That doesn't mean that company is SOC 2. You're only using AWS as an example. So it's only telling half the picture there. So that's something to bear in mind when you're doing your due diligence with a company. When you're asking for a certification, if they're only giving you AWS's or Microsoft's, that probably tells you that they haven't got that certification, report themselves.
Okay.
In terms of the on-prem infrastructure, that's a very different conversation. And it's one where, do you actually intend on staying on-premise, or do you think you're going to migrate to the cloud? Because ultimately, hardware starts to die after a period of time. It does get old, and like a car, it needs servicing after a period of time. Are you simply going to move it and use public transport, or are you going to replace it and get another vehicle? And they're the kind of CapEx, OpEx decisions you need to make on saying, well, no, I'm going to stick with an on-prem solution, which is absolutely fine, or you're going to move towards either a hybrid or a fully cloud environment, of which I think there are, in my opinion, more advantages to going cloud-based than there are by staying with an on-premises solution.
Okay, so that's I guess some of the tech piece. Then from a people standpoint in the firm, we talked about having the qualified individual. And one thing I did want to go back to is you said if a firm needs to comply with the FTC safeguards rules. So tell us who does and who doesn't. Is there like exclusions here?
There are loose exclusions, but what I don't want to do is that it's very threshold based in terms of the number of customer records that you've got, which is one of them. Saying, I believe from memory, it's actually over 5,000 records, not individual people, but just 5,000 records that you actually have to adhere to the FTC safeguards rule. Now, the reason why I think you've got to take that with a little bit of care is that does talk about reporting a notifiable incident. If you had a security incident, you actually need to report it. Now, if you had 4,999, do you still report it or do you not? And so that threshold can be a little bit dangerous depending on how you look at it. Whether you actually adhere to it or not, I think the FTC safeguards rule is a really great model just to work against anyway, because it has got all the foundational principles you should expect to see in any firm that is connected to the internet. Now, if we go back 10, 20 years, I would argue that the fundamental principles of securing a firm probably haven't changed that much. Now, look, there's no denying that technology has evolved significantly. It's indisputable. But when you think about the actual foundational elements of protecting a firm, I don't think they've changed that much at all around, backups and passwords and access controls, incident response, business continuity. They've evolved with the technology, but the fundamentals are still there.
Mm-hmm. So I know, obviously with BotKeeper, many of the firms are CAS, so client accounting services based, but if there's firms also listening, or firm leaders listening with the tax piece, the WISP obviously has become sort of like the buzzword standard, but I know you've got sort of a different view on that. So maybe let's spend just a minute talking about tax and security, since we are, heading into tax season as well.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things when you look at the cybersecurity industry, you tend to see the same terminology repeated over and over again. It does get rinsed and repeated a lot, and I think unfortunately certain terminology has crept into the market. And let's talk about the WISP for a second. When you think about the WISP, most people naturally gravitate towards a written information security plan. Now, a plan, in its general sense, is effectively probably a document which tells you that you're doing something. Whereas you look at the FTC safeguards rule, it says very clearly you need an information security program that's in a written format. Now, there's a very big difference between a program and a plan. A plan is the document, the program's what you actually do. And that's why when we talk about cybersecurity, it's not something you have, it's something that you do. And the program is the thing that's going to save you if you get into hot water. Unfortunately, I think people have just latched on to, I need a WISP, and therefore I need a document, and that document is going to make me compliant because it tells you everything that I'm actually doing. But that is nothing more than a piece of paper if you're not actually supporting it with the controls to actually protect your firm, and most importantly, your customers' data. So if you haven't got those controls in place, that piece of paper is effectively useless. And that's one thing I do try to impress upon people, is think more about the actual underlying controls to stop something from happening rather than relying on the WISP when something does.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's where, your tech can start to play, an important role as well when you're collecting that client data and getting all of that client data out of email and out of, text messages, and using, one point of, solution. And that's where, you've got to put those pieces in place. And I know we've probably got about 8 minutes left. So one thing I do want to ask you, so that we have time to really kind of dive into it, is we've touched on a lot of different things here. And, again, one of the reasons why I wanted to, have you on the edge here is to try to give, firms something that they can take away today. And, you know, if we're only going to do 3 to 5 things in our firms, at any time, it's not just because, it's this time of the year or whatever. What are the 5 things that you think every firm should be doing around cybersecurity?
So I'm going to start off with probably 5 questions that you probably want to ask, because ultimately risk is central to every business in some way, shape, or form. And depending on how much you rely on risk, will influence some of your decision making. And I think ultimately the first question is, what is it you're trying to achieve, either as a business, as an organization, or as an individual? And ask the things: what are you trying to achieve? What kind of things might affect me? Which of those factors are most important? And what should you do about it? And once you've actually taken all those questions into play, is that, how did it work and what's changed since then? So there's some of the really simple questions that would actually form the base of your risk management. And when you really take risk, you start looking at, well, what's actually of risk to my business? And that's where you start looking at assets. Now, assets in essence are anything. They are not just data, they're not just your hardware, they're also your people. You've got your employees' knowledge and their experience and their skills. You've also got your clients. You've got to treat everything as an asset, and you also need to understand what is the value of that asset to your organization. Next question is, what would happen if I didn't have access to that asset? And that's where you start thinking, well, that risk is now going to start defining how I manage that asset, whether it's data, whether it is a human being. Ultimately, everything needs to be looked at in a risk context. Once you've then moved from risk into assets, I would probably say incident response is just one of those plans that just can't be overlooked. To have an incident response plan, you then start asking yourself some natural questions in terms of, do I have a high level approach? What would happen if I did encounter a security incident? What are my roles and responsibilities in the organization, such as, Gaynor, what are you going to perform during this incident? What am I going to perform in this incident? Everyone needs to have a role and responsibility. I'd also even have some really standard practice saying that, well, if I encountered a phishing incident or a malware incident or a data breach, just some standard actions you can perform very quickly, just to get the whole incident moving, so you can get it under control a bit quicker.
Yeah.
So risk into asset, and as a operational aspect, I think the incident response plan is actually quite a handy one, because to have all of those things, you need to ask questions. And when you start asking the questions, you start producing some very fruitful information around what is it I need to do to protect my firm, and what is it I need to grow successfully.
hmm So those are, great questions that we'll put. I know I'll probably put them in the description, when we post on YouTube as well, so that firms have that as a takeaway. And so, with just a few minutes left, is there anything that you would like to impress upon firms from the cybersecurity perspective? I know I've been doing all the question asking here.
Yeah, look, I think just when it comes to education, training your employees, you don't necessarily need to go full tilt and invest yourself in a cybersecurity platform to educate. There is so much information that's readily available through government websites, through industry firms, AICPA, CPI crossings, etc. Use that kind of information to educate yourself and also your firm. The other thing I really want to be very clear about is we keep hearing about the sophistication of cyber attacks and how everything is becoming more sophisticated. Honestly, from what I see, I really don't see that as actually being the case. There are so many attacks that still rely on such basic techniques. A significant number of cyber attacks are caused either by human error, exploiting poor password management or hygiene, or even things like outdated software. So don't get hung up on the fact that technology is becoming more complex, that you automatically think that cyber attacks are becoming more sophisticated as a result of it. I don't think they are. What really is, if you can get the basics right and you can get them done consistently, you're going to be in a really good position, regardless of the evolving technology. But that being said, just keep an eye on how it actually influences what you do in your firm.
Well, that's great advice, and I would also just say that cybersecurity, while it might seem that it's all about tech and data, at the baseline really is its business continuity. Because if something happens where you have a data breach, I mean, there's the trust factor and the credibility factor, but then there's also just the business operations factor, where if something takes your firm down, that's your livelihood, and we don't want that to happen. Or
Yeah,
to have an incident where you really are having to deal with some reputation issues as well. So that's, and I think too, from a staff perspective, if you've got a team, they want to know that they're operating like within a safe system and not be worried about, you know, phishing emails and things like that, and to know what they need to do about that, and to talk about it as a team, and it really becomes operationalized in your firm, as opposed to the firm owner is dealing with a WISP plan or whatever. Nobody else, it doesn't cascade down. That's cascading it down is where the power is too.
absolutely. And I know we've literally got a couple of minutes, but the thing is, cybersecurity is a part of the business regardless. It's not like a separate thing. Just very quickly, cybersecurity culture, as an example. I don't think you need to have a cybersecurity culture in your business to be successful. The fact is, a cybersecurity culture creates a silo where you've got this separate thing that you need to adhere to. If you've got security awareness, you've got a security aware workforce, it just becomes part and parcel to, it's integrated. So at the end of the day, cybersecurity is there to help you make money. It's to help you to stop losing money. It's designed to help you grow the business. It's not a separate thing by any means. It's simply a part and parcel of your business. And if you treat it that way, you'll integrate with it much more successfully.
Yeah, that's great advice, and I think that's super advice going into a new year, and definitely check out this episode again, to get some of the key points that Luke was talking about, and I'm sure that BotKeeper will share contact info as well. So here's to making cybersecurity something that you're doing in your firm and not just the plan itself. So thanks again, Luke. I really
Thank you.
enjoyed this.
Cheers. Thank you.
You're welcome.